A coffin was pre-booked, days before the victim died. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I'm your host, Harrington. Comment your city. I love seeing them. Wolfe opens death's schedule. It was one of those evenings when London lay muffled in its own breath. The November fog had settled low upon the streets, and the lamps along Baker Street shone as blurred moons through a woolly atmosphere. Dr. John Watson, returning late from his rounds, had scarcely removed his gloves when Mrs. Hudson announced that a gentleman, she stressed the word with a curious gravity, desired to see Mr. Sherlock Holmes upon a matter deeply unpleasant. Holmes, who had been bowing his long figure over a volume of chemical memoranda by the grate, lifted his head at the word. The lamplight struck the clean, hawk-like line of his face. If there is music in London's gloom to the ordinary man, it is in the muffled wheels and the crack of whips. To Holmes, the true prelude was always the footfall hesitating at our door. It was thus that the game so often began. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," said Holmes. A man of middle years entered with a manner both rigid and contrite. His hat, glossy and sober, was held tightly to his chest. The black broadcloth of his coat had a dull sheen like watered silk, and his white collar cut sharply at his throat. There was no mistaking his profession, for even in the fog he bore with him that curious odor of camphor and shavings which attends the trade. "My name is Silas Pendrell, gentlemen," he announced, bowing at the hearthrug. "I keep an establishment in Saffron Hill, Pendrell and Sons, undertakers. I crave your pardon for the hour and the subject. I was told that Mr. Holmes," his eyes flickered timidly toward my companion, "does not refuse singular cases." Holmes gestured him to the chair opposite. "You do me too much honor. I refuse dull ones. Pray be seated." Mr. Pendrell obeyed, setting his hat upon his knees as though it were a fragile urn. His eyelids trembled. "I have come, sir, because someone ordered a coffin of me today, for Tuesday, and not for any who have died or lie dying, but for a gentleman I believe to be very much alive." I started at this, but Holmes merely inclined his chin. "State the facts, Mr. Pendrell, as you observe them. Every particular." The undertaker drew a flat case from his pocket and produced a leaf of paper, thin, pink and ruled, upon which were set down the dimensions and particulars of a coffin. The script was a neat, clerkly hand, and in the margin a penciled note. "Delivery by Tuesday noon." A smear of dark wax made a little kidney-shaped blot near the total. "This is my order form," Pendrell continued, his voice thick with distress. "It was filled in at my shop this afternoon at 4:15. The gentleman gave the name of Mr. Hubert Larch and the address as number 3 Dundas Street, St. Luke's. He insisted upon an oak shell with an outer casing and a lead lining, an uncommon request except for those carried some distance. He specified 3 extra inches of depth, though the measurement is for a man of ordinary height. He would have the lid fastened with hidden screws and the seams sealed with wax to keep him safe from meddling hands. So he said. The man swallowed. "He paid a handsomely heavy deposit in half-sovereigns, sir. 10 of them of the Jubilee head." Holmes's hand extended, and Pendrell obediently placed the coins in his palm. Holmes weighed them lightly, then returned them without comment. "Go on," said Holmes. "The name for the plate is Mr. Alistair Vale," Pendrell went on, and his fingers tightened upon the brim of his hat. "But Mr. Vale, if I am not mistaken, who is a living gentleman of high repute, a director in the firm of Vale and Borthwick, shipping agents upon the Minories." The buyer requested that the words "A Quietus Tuesday" be engraved beneath the name. He would have no lilies, no theatricalities, he said, but a single band of black ribbon. His manner was cool, almost brisk. Yet I swear to you, gentlemen, a man does not order a coffin with such particularity for the living unless he means harm. Watson, though I write here in the third person of myself, could not suppress the involuntary exclamation that rose to his lips. The fog outside seemed suddenly to have crept into the room, bringing with it a chill not of the weather. "You know this Mr. Vale?" Holmes asked. "I know of him, sir. Many know of him, and his name is not one to be lightly engraved." Pendrell's gaze shifted to the fire. "I confess I made no protest at the time. Trade is trade, and there are folk who order in advance. But when the gentleman had gone, I examined the form and found the oddities crowding upon me. The address in St. Luke's, well, it is a muse, and number 3 stands untenanted since Michaelmas. The phrase, 'a quietus, Tuesday,' has a dreadful ring to it. And then, if you please to observe the margin, those figures, 1135, were penciled by his own hand, though no man in my shop uses so fine a pencil." He looked up, almost pleading. "I told Inspector Lestrade. He laughed, sir. He said if Mr. Vale took a fancy to practice his funeral beforehand, it was no matter for Scotland Yard. But I cannot put my mind to rest. I fear—" His voice failed. "The gentleman who placed the order," Holmes said. "Describe him." "Of middle height, spare. Gloved, though the day was not cold. Dressed in brown tweed under a dark overcoat of the better cut. He wore his hat low. His voice was soft, with a slight break upon his S's. I noticed, odd thing to notice, that he smelt faintly of carbolic, and he handled the coins as one unused to money, turning them like new toys." Holmes leaned back, a haze of interest passing across his features. He took the order form and held it to the lamp, then to the fire, tilting it so that the light slid along the fibers. "You have done well to come," he said at last, and the undertaker's rigid shoulders eased by a hair's breadth. "Pray do not reproach yourself for not calling the yard sooner. You were right, it was not a matter for them, at least not yet." Watson saw the familiar quickening in his friend, the grey eyes brighter, the long fingers steepled and alive with suppressed energy. To many such cases, Holmes had turned with languid disdain. Here, however, there was that rare admixture to set his blood astir. Meticulous preparation married to a whiff of theatre and a time appointed, as if the very hour had been penciled on a calendar of fate. "You will take it, sir?" Pendrell ventured. Holmes rose. "When a coffin is ordered for a man who still breathes, Mr. Pendrell, the time for interference is before he is measured." He turned to me. "Watson, your Ulster. We shall visit Saffron Hill to examine the scene of this commerce, and then, if Providence smiles, pay our respects to Mr. Alistair Vale before Tuesday writes its chapter." Pendrell stood, his face a mask of gratitude. "You relieve me, gentlemen. I shall obey any instruction." "For the present, fulfill the order to the letter," Holmes replied. "Pack the shell, cut the plate, keep Tuesday sacred, and, on no account, permit the buyer to alter his instructions. The slightest tremor in the web will frighten the spider." As the undertaker withdrew, Holmes remained with the pink paper in his hand. He tapped the kidney-shaped wax blot with his forefinger. "You observed the wax, Watson?" "I did," I answered. "Sealing wax, surely." "Certainly. Green and flecked with mica, a cheap composition. You will find it used abundantly in one class of office and scarcely at all in another." He smiled faintly. "But we must not gallop. There are several trifles here which, taken together, form a very curious song." Outside, the fog pressed its face to the windows like a child at a sweet shop. Within, Holmes thrust the order into his pocket, drew his scarf close about his throat, and clapped me on the shoulder with uncharacteristic warmth. "Come, my dear fellow, Tuesday is not so far away." The cab carried them slowly through the gauzy veil of fog that thickened as they turned into Holborn. Holmes leaned forward, elbows on knees, his eyes fixed on the dim blur of the street beyond the glass. He was silent, dangerously silent, as I had learned to call it. To break that stillness was to shatter some intricate mental clockwork in full swing. I waited. When at last he spoke, it was as though his thoughts had flowed seamlessly from our visitor's words. You noted, Watson, that Pendrell's customer requested a lead-lined shell. I did. A rather morbid extravagance, surely. Extravagance, yes, but purpose hides behind cost. A lead lining is used to prevent seepage, of odor, or, in rare cases, of gas. Yet I wonder if it may not serve here to prevent the intrusion of air instead. I frowned. Air? He smiled faintly. You remember, perhaps, the experiment of Monsieur Pasteur, the preservation of organisms by exclusion of oxygen? I mention it only as an analogy, of course. Still, it is odd that our phantom buyer should have taken such precautions. To whom does one fear air, save to one who will yet breathe it? Before I could respond, the cab jolted to a stop before a narrow shop wedged between a pawnbroker's and a tobacconist's. A swinging lantern above the door bore the inscription, Pendrell and Sons, funeral furnishers. The windows were curtained, the glass veiled with moisture. Within, the air smelled of varnish, crepe, and damp oak. Pendrell himself awaited us, his pallor accentuated by the lamplight. I've kept everything as it was, Mr. Holmes, he whispered, leading us behind the counter. Upon a bench lay several boards of planed oak, the beginnings of the order. Holmes passed a long, thin hand over them, his eyes glinting in satisfaction. Excellent workmanship. You see, Watson, the fresh cut, the resin still tacky. Now, Mr. Pendrell, the writing implement your client used? Pendrell produced a slim silver mechanical pencil. Left behind upon the counter, sir. Holmes examined it beneath the lamp. Very good. The knurling is foreign, a German make, I should say. Observe the fine milling at the barrel, Watson. Such instruments are not sold in this country for under 10 shillings. Our man writes well, pays in gold, yet uses a cheap sealing wax, a combination most instructive. He took a pinch of the wax scrapings from the form and held them to his nose. Minted scent, green wax of the legal variety used by registry clerks. Our fellow is no tradesman, but he walks daily near bureaucracy. He turned suddenly to Pendrell. Did he speak of delivery? For Tuesday noon to number 3, Dundas Street, St. Luke's, sir. Holmes nodded. And the payment, was it made from a purse? From a paper packet, sir. Folded. He counted the coins carefully, by touch as if unused to their weight. Holmes's eyes brightened. By touch? Watson, what does that suggest to you? That he might be blind or nearly so? Not blind, no. His measurements were precise, his writing clear. But a man accustomed to ink or ledger work, not coin. A pen pusher, then, or clerk. He thanked Pendrell, leaving a sovereign upon the counter. That will suffice for your trouble. Continue as we have agreed. We shall handle the rest. Outside, the fog had grown heavier still, curling like smoke about the lamp-posts. Holmes led the way briskly toward Holborn Viaduct, his scarf drawn high. What next? I asked, matching his stride. Dundas Street. The address is the one false note in the melody, and I mean to hear it out before it fades. We found the street a narrow row of mews and workshops, shuttered and damp. Number 3 stood precisely as Pendrell had described. An empty dwelling, door locked, windows filmed with grime. A tattered board proclaimed, "To let, apply within." Holmes stooped with his lantern and examined the threshold. There has been no footfall here since last week, he murmured. The dust lies perfect, yet see here. He pointed to a dark smear near the keyhole, a faint glimmer of greenish wax. Our friend has been here, and recently. He tried the door, found it locked, and sealed a note or token within the keyway. He drew from his pocket a small instrument case and selected a wire. A moment later, the lock yielded with a soft click. The door swung open to reveal darkness within. We entered. The place reeked of mildew and damp plaster. A single chair stood in the center of the floor. On it lay a scrap of newspaper folded around a small object. Holmes opened it delicately. Inside lay a piece of paper, torn from a ledger upon which was written in the same neat hand as the Coffin order, "Quietus confirmed. Tuesday noon, Vale to be present." I caught my breath. Then it is murder indeed. Holmes slipped the note into his pocketbook. Murder, or a drama rehearsed with the devil as stage manager. Either way, Tuesday shall not find Mr. Vale alone. We stepped back into the fog. The gaslight trembled upon the mist, and the faint toll of St. Luke's bell came through the night air like the slow ticking of a clock running down. Holmes stood very still, his eyes fixed upon some inward vision. "Watson," he said softly, "this is no ordinary commission. Somewhere behind that bland, clerkly hand moves a mind of uncommon calculation. A man orders a coffin not to conceal a death, but to summon one. We must learn whether Alistair Vale walks unsuspecting toward it, or whether he himself has written the order." With that, he hailed a cab, the wheels hissing upon the wet stones as we turned eastward toward the Minories, to pay a visit to the living man for whom the coffin waited. Sims gave a nervous laugh, rubbing his thumb as though to wipe away an invisible stain. "A trifle, sir, nothing more. I was sealing a bundle of manifests yesterday when I upset the wax ladle and scalded myself. I dressed it with carbolic, my usual remedy. The scent lingers, I fear." Holmes's eyes drifted to the man's right hand. A narrow brass band encircled the middle finger, its rim chipped into a tiny crescent. He said nothing, but I saw his gaze sharpen. At that moment, the door opened, and a florid, square-shouldered gentleman entered with the air of one who believes the world his rightful possession. "Ah, Holmes, I thought it must be you. Lestrade of the Yard told me you'd been meddling in this business." It was Mr. Borthwick, Vale's partner. His tone bore the kind of authority that conceals unease. "I meddle only when invited," Holmes replied evenly. "You are just in time to enlighten us. Your clerk, Mr. Sims, was preparing an order numbered 1135. Something about a consignment for the Scythia." Borthwick's eyes flicked toward the ledger, then back. "A shipment of coffins bound for Valparaiso. Ordinary business for us." Mr. Sims was entering the details, but I stopped him. The paperwork was incomplete. I told him to leave the entry blank until I verified the client's credit. Holmes's expression was unreadable. "The client's name?" Borthwick hesitated a fraction too long. "A foreign agent, Hubert Larch, representing a South American exporter. His credentials were peculiar, I admit. Still, in our trade one sees all sorts." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And this Mr. Larch, when did he last call?" "Yesterday afternoon, just before closing." "The same hour," I could not help interjecting, "that a man of that name ordered a coffin from Pendrell's establishment." A flicker crossed Borthwick's features, swiftly suppressed. "Coincidence, Doctor. The world thrives on them." Holmes smiled faintly. "It does, though I confess I find this particular one somewhat extravagant." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the outer door and the unmistakable tread of Inspector Lestrade. He entered briskly, his coat glistening with rain, and nodded to Holmes with professional wariness. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. I hear you've run across something queer again. Mind if I take a hand?" Holmes gestured courteously. "By all means, Inspector. We were discussing coincidences. Perhaps you will help us decide whether one has become too improbable." Lestrade's small eyes darted between us. "Aye, that coffin business. Mr. Pendrell's been flapping about it. You think this fellow Sims here had something to do with it?" Sims went pale. "Sir, I protest." Lestrade stepped forward, producing a crumpled paper from his pocket. "We found this in the chemist's bin at Houndsditch. Order for carbolic acid, made out to Edwin Sims, 3:40 yesterday. You were there, eh? That gives you 20 minutes to reach Saffron Hill by cab. Seems tight, but not impossible." "I went nowhere near Saffron Hill," cried Sims. "After the chemist, I returned straight here. Mr. Borthwick can vouch for me." Borthwick's gaze was cool. "I saw you return at 4:15, perhaps." You were out longer than usual." Lestrade turned a triumphant glance to Holmes. "There's your interval, Mr. Holmes. And look here." He drew a handful of gold coins from his pocket. 10 half-sovereigns of the Jubilee head found in Sims's drawer. Matches the undertaker's deposit to a T. A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Sims stammered incoherently, his hands trembling. "They're mine. My wages for the quarter. Mr. Borthwick advanced them yesterday morning." Borthwick raised his brows. "I? Nonsense. We pay clerks on Friday. The cash box hasn't been opened since last week." Lestrade clapped a hand upon the clerk's shoulder. "That'll do. I'll have you down to the yard, my lad. You can explain your wages there." Holmes's voice cut through the rising commotion, low but sharp. "Not so fast, Inspector." Lestrade scowled. "You've some better notion?" "I have an incomplete one," said Holmes, "but enough to see that arresting this man now would be premature. There are aspects of the case that do not fit. For instance, the handwriting on Pendrell's order and the note found in Dundas Street are steady, deliberate, unhurried. Hardly the scrawl of a man trembling from guilt or haste. Mr. Sims, would you kindly write the words, 'A quietus Tuesday' on this slip?" Sims obeyed with shaking fingers. Holmes compared the result with the earlier papers, then folded both away. "Quite so," he murmured. "Interesting, but not identical." He turned to Borthwick. "Tell me, sir, do you by chance use sealing wax in your correspondence?" "Of course," said Borthwick, producing from his desk a green stick flecked faintly with gold dust. Holmes examined it. "A finer composition than that used on the Coffin order. Yours contains real mica, the other an inferior imitation. Yet I note your ring, a signet, heavy, with a device of twin dolphins. The impression upon Mr. Vale's envelope bore only a plain oval with a nick, as though the device had been masked. Curious, is it not?" Borthwick's mouth thinned. "What are you implying?" "Nothing yet. But before I draw conclusions, I must ask that the consignment numbered 1135 remain untouched. No paperwork, no loading. I will take responsibility for any delay." Lestrade bristled. "Then what do you mean to do, Mr. Holmes?" "Observe," said Holmes simply. "There is a hand directing all this, a calculating mind that writes of death while seated comfortably among the living. If we move too soon, the author will vanish and the play end in silence. For now, we watch the stage." He gathered his coat about him and nodded to me. "Come, Watson. We have one call more to make before nightfall, at Pendrell's. Our friend the undertaker may have had another visitor." As we stepped into the dreary afternoon, Lestrade's voice followed from the doorway. "Mark my words, Holmes. This clerk's your man. It's plain as print." Holmes smiled into the drizzle. "My dear Watson," he murmured, "when the evidence fits too neatly, it was tailored for the occasion. Let us see who stitched the seams." The cab door closed, and the fog swallowed us once more. We found Pendrell's establishment much altered since our previous visit. The polished boards at the front glistened from a recent mopping, and the undertaker himself met us at the door with evident agitation. His usually measured tone had acquired a tremor that betrayed sleeplessness. "Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, "thank heaven you have come. There has been a most alarming occurrence. A messenger called here an hour after you left yesterday, bearing written instructions purporting to be from you. He directed that the coffin for Mr. Vale be delivered this very morning to the address originally specified, Dundas Street. I was suspicious, sir, for the handwriting was similar, but not quite yours. Still, the man was so confident, and he mentioned details only you could have known. The green wax, the engraving, the precise measurements, that at last I consented. The cart had barely set out when I received a telegram, this time genuinely from your rooms, ordering that nothing be delivered before Tuesday. I turned the carriage back at once, but when it reached Dundas Street, there was no trace of the messenger, and the keyhole—" He paused, wiping his brow. The keyhole had been freshly sealed again, this time with red wax. Holmes's expression hardened, and I saw that rarest of things, a flash of anger in his eyes. A bold move. They are playing my hand against me. Did you keep the false note? Here, sir. Holmes unfolded the paper and compared it silently to a sheet from his own pocketbook. A fine forgery, he said at last. Note the flourish upon the H. It would deceive even a trained eye. Yet the ink betrays it, an inferior violet compound, common in public offices. Our phantom has access to stationery and habitually writes under gaslight. That narrows the field to perhaps a few hundred clerks in London. Pendrell wrung his hands. I beg your pardon, Mr. Holmes, if my blunder has endangered the case. You have done precisely what I should have done in your place, Holmes said briskly. The very haste of our adversary may yet serve us. Watson, we must see the premises immediately. Mr. Pendrell, kindly remain here and admit no visitors, however plausible their credentials. The day had grown damp and colourless by the time we reached Dundas Street once more. The dismal row of empty houses loomed ghost-like in the haze. At number 3 the door was closed as before, but a deep furrow of cartwheels and footprints led to and from the curb. Holmes crouched to examine them. One man, one horse, he murmured. The coffin reached this spot, but never passed within. Yet see here, the drag of a box corner upon the stone threshold. They removed it hastily, perhaps after examining its contents. We entered. The chair remained in its former place, but upon it now lay a single black ribbon, narrow, smooth, unknotted. Holmes picked it up delicately, holding it to his nose. Fresh silk, woven within the week and purchased from Shadwell's milliners by the scent of their distinctive polish. I begin to discern the design. Watson, fetch the lantern. He swept his light across the floorboards, revealing a scatter of sawdust and a faint smear of something white at the corner. Plaster dust, he observed. There was once a box here, heavy, rectangular, whose base scraped the wall as it was dragged. Note the fragment of wax on the skirting, red as Mr. Pendrell reported. They sealed something within these walls, or meant us to think they did. A low whistle escaped him. Observe this nail head, bright from recent removal. Yes, there has been a panel prized open. He worked deftly with his knife, and a section of the wall yielded outward. Behind it, to my horror, lay a narrow recess lined with lead sheeting. Within was a small wooden crate, no longer than a man's torso. Its lid was half screwed down. Holmes paused only to examine the screws. Factory made, identical to those supplied with Pendrell's order, he said softly. So the counterfeit coffin has been built already, and sooner than we thought. He drew out his pocket lens and peered at the side of the box. No maker's mark, but, here, a penciled initial, E.S. You perceive it, Watson? Edwin Sims, I cried. Precisely. Yet Sims himself could not have done this alone, nor without tools and workspace. Someone wished his name to be found here. Someone who knew we should search for it. The implication struck me dumb. Holmes closed the panel carefully. Our quarry is methodical, he continued. He forges handwriting, commands the services of innocent intermediaries, and plants evidence to divert suspicion. But he errs in one thing. He underestimates my appetite for details. That red wax is of a brand used only by the Colonial Shipping Office, Whitechapel, the same establishment through which all freight for Valparaiso is processed. There, I think, lies the true theatre of our mystery. We withdrew to the street. Holmes paused beside the cab, his gaze sweeping the dreary vista. Watson, the threads converge. At 11:35 Tuesday, something is to happen. Perhaps at the docks, perhaps here. The name Vale appears again and again, not as victim alone, but as symbol. If my reasoning be correct, this affair is not a mere threat of murder. It is the rehearsal for one. His voice lowered to a murmur. Tonight we go to the docks. I shall need a disguise and your revolver. Bring both. The spider is stirring, and before Tuesday dawns, we shall glimpse its web entire." As we climbed into the cab, I felt the weight of the fog settle once more around us, thick with the scent of tar and rain, and a chill certainty took hold that before this game reached its end, we should find not one coffin waiting, but two. The docks loomed ahead like a blackened ribcage against the mist. Gas lamps hissed along the quay, their dim light catching the sheen of rain on cobblestones. A vast hush lay over the river, broken only by the creak of mooring ropes and the occasional call of a watchman. Holmes had exchanged his usual attire for the rough garb of a ship's porter, complete with tarred cap and a muffler drawn up to his chin. I followed in more modest disguise, feeling a fool in borrowed oilskins and heavy boots. Yet the transformation suited him. His tall, spare figure seemed suddenly made for the shadows. "We must blend with the tide of labor," he whispered as we approached the wharf gates. "The Colonial Shipping Office lies yonder, and the Valparaiso consignment is berthed at Pier 7. Watch closely, Watson. If I am right, tonight's business will turn the key in this curious coffin." We entered the yard unchallenged, moving among the dock hands who toiled by lantern light over crates and barrels. The air reeked of salt and tar and the sharp tang of wet rope. Holmes's gaze roved constantly, missing nothing. The cargo tallies pinned to posts, the stacks of labeled chests, even the markings chalked upon the cobbles where consignments awaited inspection. At last, he halted before a shed marked Customs, Private Storage. A single watchman sat within, bent over a ledger. Holmes motioned for silence, then stooped to peer through a crack in the planking. Inside stood a wooden case, long and narrow, its lid freshly nailed and sealed with the familiar red wax. The faint inscription C1135 VP was scrawled across the side in black. Holmes's fingers tightened around my sleeve. "You see it, Watson? The number 1135 again, and the initials VP. Our friend's handiwork, beyond question. That crate is the counterfeit coffin's twin." "Then the murder is to take place here," I whispered. "Possibly. Or the crate will convey something or someone beyond our reach by morning." A footstep sounded behind us. Holmes vanished into the shadows with feline grace. A figure in a dark overcoat approached the shed, glancing nervously about. Even in the poor light I recognized the thick-set build and square jaw. It was Borthwick, Vale's partner. He tapped softly at the door. "Sims?" The watchman looked up. "Inside, sir. Been waiting since 8. Borthwick entered, closing the door behind him. Holmes drew me close to the gap. Their voices came muffled but distinct. "You're certain the order's cleared?" said Borthwick. "Aye, sir. The manifest's signed. She sails at noon tomorrow, but the inspector'll want the customs docket in the morning. Leave that to me. The contents must be untouched until it's loaded. Understand?" The man nodded. "It's your risk, not mine." Borthwick pressed something into his hand, gold by the glint of it, and turned toward the door. Holmes moved before I could stop him. In one swift motion, he stepped from the shadows and stood framed in the doorway, the lantern light cutting sharp angles across his face. "Good evening, Mr. Borthwick," he said evenly. "We meet at last in your true theatre." Borthwick recoiled as if struck. "Holmes, what devil's trick?" "The trick, sir, lies not in my appearance, but in your duplicity. This crate, bearing the code of your own firm, was to be loaded aboard the Scythia with false clearance papers. Its contents, if I mistake not, would have contained not merchandise, but a corpse, or something made to pass for one." Borthwick's composure faltered. "You speak nonsense." Holmes stepped closer, his tone icy. "Do I? The coffin ordered in Vale's name, the forged notes, the planted evidence against your clerk, all form a pattern too neat to be chance. You sought to simulate Vale's death, to have his supposed body shipped abroad while he yet lived, thereby securing control of your firm and its accounts. But when he survived your earlier schemes, you turned to subtler measures. A lead-lined coffin, sealed from air, perfect to hold either the living or the dead. Borthwick's face had gone grey. You cannot prove... Holmes produced the scrap of paper from Dundas Street. Your hand betrayed you, sir. The phrase quietus confirmed. The flourish on the Q identical to that in your company ledgers. And tonight you have proved the rest by your presence here. The watchman, seeing danger, made for the door. I caught his arm. Holmes's revolver appeared in his hand like magic. Lestrade awaits at the gate, he said quietly. Shall I summon him, or will you make a clean breast of it? Borthwick's shoulders sagged. For a moment he stood motionless, the lamplight catching the rain upon his brow. Then, with a hoarse cry, he lunged, not at Holmes, but toward the crate. Holmes fired into the air, and the shot brought a rush of boots from the quay. Lestrade burst in with 2 constables. Take him, Holmes ordered. He was about to destroy his masterpiece. They seized Borthwick, who fought like a cornered animal before collapsing in despair. The watchman, seeing his employer undone, confessed at once. The crate was to be declared a sample shipment for Valparaiso, but within it was to lie the true Mr. Vale, drugged, sealed alive, and dispatched beyond reach before Tuesday noon. The plan would have left Borthwick sole master of their firm, with Vale legally presumed dead by the time the vessel reached port. As Lestrade led the wretch away, Holmes turned to me with that rare look of grim satisfaction that marked his hardest victories. You perceive now, Watson, why the lead lining was vital. Our villain feared the body. Still living might betray him by sound or scent. The extra depth, the screws, even the red wax, all precautions to make death seem absolute. We stood a moment longer in the drizzle, watching the constables bear their prisoner toward the yard carriage. The fog closed behind them like a curtain, leaving the dock silent save for the lap of the river. Holmes replaced his revolver and drew up his collar. The stage is cleared, he murmured. Only the final act remains. To inform Mr. Vale that his coffin has been ordered, filled and cancelled within 48 hours. I trust, he added with a faint smile, he will appreciate my punctuality. And as we walked back through the sleeping streets, the first streaks of dawn pale upon the Thames, I thought once again of the strange symmetry of Holmes's world. How death itself could be but another puzzle waiting to be solved, and how, in his hands, even a coffin became a clue to life. It was close upon 7 when we reached Baker Street once more. The gas lamps outside were still burning, pale against the growing light, and the first carts of Covent Garden rattled distantly through the morning hush. Holmes entered without a word, threw his disguise upon the chair, and went straight to his chemical table. There he stood for some time, testing the residue of the red wax upon a glass slide, his movements precise, almost serene, as if the night's tumult had not touched him. I had learned to leave him to his thoughts at such moments, and so occupied myself with lighting the fire. Presently he turned, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Watson," said he, "we have netted the hand, but not yet the mind that moved it. You mean Borthwick was not the principal?" "Not quite. He was the instrument. Greedy, desperate, yet too coarse for the finer mechanisms of forgery and misdirection. No, behind his bungling lies a subtler intelligence, one that guided him with invisible strings. I must discover who first placed those strings in his grasp." Before I could reply, there came the familiar double knock of a cab on the curb. A moment later, the door opened, and Inspector Lestrade stepped in, looking damp but exultant. "You'll be glad to hear, Mr. Holmes, that our man's locked up safe at the yard. Confessed to enough to hang himself twice over. Seems he meant to ship Vale off alive and inherit the firm's fortune. We found drafts of the forged papers in his desk, and a false will naming him sole executor." Holmes inclined his head but did not appear satisfied. "And yet," he said quietly, "you arrested him too easily." Tell me, Inspector, was there no word of the person who supplied him with the counterfeit forms? No sign of where the green wax was procured? Lestrade frowned. Nothing of the sort. The man claims he acted alone. Holmes smiled faintly. Then he lies, for I can prove that the counterfeit stationery came not from Vale's offices, but from the Registry of Shipping, where none but officials handle it. There's a ghost in this machine, Lestrade, and until we unmask him, the play is not ended. Lestrade muttered something about Holmes's fondness for overcomplicating a simple affair, then took his leave, muttering cheerfully that Scotland Yard was content enough without ghosts in ledgers. Holmes watched him go, then reached for his violin. As he drew the bow across the strings, a low, haunting chord filled the room. "I do not play for music, Watson," he said, almost to himself. "I play for balance. When the mind outruns the nerves, sound steadies the pace." He fell silent again, but the image music continued, a slow-rising theme that seemed to echo the morning fog beyond the window. At last, he set the instrument aside and spoke abruptly. "We must see Mr. Vale once more. He deserves to hear of his partner's fall, and I must test a theory that depends upon his reaction." The drive to Norwood was swift under a clearing sky. Vale received us with warmth, though the strain of recent days showed in his haggard features. "You bring me news?" he asked eagerly. "Your life has been spared, Mr. Vale," said Holmes. "Your partner, Borthwick, plotted to simulate your death for profit. He is now in custody." For a moment, Vale closed his eyes, visibly struggling between relief and disbelief. "Borthwick," he murmured. "God forgive me, I suspected as much, but not that he would descend to murder." "Your instinct served you well," said Holmes. "Tell me, have you ever employed or known a man named Hubert Larch?" "Larch? Never heard the name." "Nor had Borthwick, until 3 weeks ago," Holmes continued smoothly. "A letter was sent to him, purporting to come from an importer in Valparaiso, offering a lucrative shipping contract. That letter was forged by the same hand that imitated your own in the Coffin order. The purpose was to draw your firm into correspondence with a fictitious client whose identity could later be used to mask a crime. It was no mere whim, Mr. Vale. It was the prelude to a larger deception." Vale stared at him. "Then someone beyond Borthwick meant my ruin." Holmes nodded. "Someone who knows the business of the docks intimately, who has access to freight documents, sealing wax, and registry ledgers. I speak of a clerk, or former clerk, in the Colonial Office. Do you recall dismissing such a man?" Vale frowned, thinking deeply. "Yes, about 2 years ago. A sullen fellow named Harker, dismissed for tampering with invoices. But surely—" Holmes rose, his eyes gleaming. "Harker, the very man. His handwriting is identical to the forgery upon the Coffin order. It was he who guided Borthwick, and, when the net closed, left him to bear the weight. I would wager my reputation that this Harker still walks free, and that he intends to complete his revenge on Tuesday at 11:35 precisely." Vale blanched. "But what can he gain now?" "Vengeance," said Holmes gravely. "He has lost his agent, but not his will. A man who spends years constructing such a design does not abandon it because one pawn is taken. There will be another move." That evening, Holmes dispatched 6 telegrams to the docks, the registry, and Scotland Yard. Then, drawing the blinds, he returned to his seat before the fire. "The pattern is clear, Watson. The green wax was the first note, the red the last. Between them lies Tuesday, the day fixed from the beginning." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a murmur. At 11:35, a consignment marked C1135 was to leave the docks. Borthwick believed it carried Vale's coffin. In truth, it was meant to carry something else entirely. Proof, perhaps, or destruction. We must be there when it moves. Until then, we wait. The hours that followed were long and silent. I saw Holmes's restlessness only in the twitch of his fingers and the occasional flare of his pipe. Outside, the city dimmed into night, and somewhere in its labyrinth of wharves and alleys, a vengeful mind was surely counting the hours toward Tuesday. Just before midnight, there came a light knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face pale. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but a messenger's just brought this for you. Said it was urgent." Holmes took the envelope, slit it open, and read. His eyes hardened, and he passed it to me without a word. The single line within read, "The quietus delayed. The river waits for no man." There was no signature, only a small smear of green wax in the corner. Holmes rose slowly, his expression composed but fierce. "Watson," he said, "the curtain rises again. We shall be on the river before dawn." The Thames lay under a shroud of mist, its slow tide glimmering faintly beneath the scattered lights of the embankment. It was 3:30 when Holmes and I reached the wharf near Wapping. A pale moon struggled against the fog, lighting the outlines of barges moored along the water, their shapes spectral in the gloom. The message with the smear of green wax had been brief, yet Holmes treated it with the gravity of a death warrant. We were guided by instinct now, his instinct honed to that uncanny edge that always signaled the closing act of a case. Holmes had secured a small launch through a police contact, and we slipped along the current with only the rhythmic plash of oars to disturb the silence. He sat forward, his keen profile cut sharply against the faint lamplight. "The river waits for no man," he repeated softly, quoting the message. "That, Watson, is not a threat. It is a schedule. Something will move tonight, perhaps before dawn, and we must be in its path when it does." I could not resist a shiver. The damp air seemed charged with foreboding. "You believe Harker will attempt to flee?" "Flee?" Holmes's tone carried the faintest edge of contempt. "He is not the fleeing kind. He is a dramatist, Watson, a man who writes his revenge in acts and curtains. He delayed his quietus, yes, but only to change the setting. I suspect his final tableau will take place not in a coffin, but on the water itself." We drifted past the looming cranes and silent warehouses until Holmes motioned to stop. "Oh, here," he whispered. "This stretch lies directly beneath the Colonial Office quay. That is where the manifests are transferred at dawn from barge to rail. You recall the crate marked C1135. It was meant to travel from here." He consulted his watch, its faint ticking oddly loud in the mist. "If I am not mistaken, we are minutes from the appointed hour." We waited in silence, the fog thick as wool. Somewhere upriver, the chug of an engine broke the stillness. A lantern glowed faintly through the murk, then another, and soon the outline of a flat-bottomed barge came into view, moving slow and deliberate against the tide. 2 men were aboard, one at the rudder, the other crouched beside a crate secured mid-deck. Even at that distance I saw the telltale ceiling of red wax glimmer along its edges. Holmes's hand fell on my arm. "Do not move," he breathed. "Let them make their play." The barge drew alongside the quay. The man at the rudder jumped ashore and disappeared into the shadows of the warehouse. The second figure, tall, lean, his coat flapping in the wind, remained by the crate, striking a match to his pipe. The brief flare illuminated his face, gaunt and narrow, with eyes that gleamed like glass in the dark. "That," whispered Holmes, "is Harker." I could feel Holmes's tension beside me, though he remained still as stone. Harker bent over the crate, unscrewing one corner of the lid. A faint, metallic sound followed, the rattle of chain, perhaps, and then he drew something from within, a small cylindrical canister, no larger than a man's forearm. He placed it carefully upon the deck, took a fuse from his pocket, and began to attach it with meticulous care. I gasped, realizing the dreadful truth. Holmes, explosives? Exactly. He means to obliterate the evidence, perhaps the entire quay, so that no trace remains of his design. The river waits for no man indeed. Holmes's hand went to his revolver, but he hesitated. Too far to shoot with certainty. We must board him." He gestured to the oars, and silently we drew closer, our small craft cutting through the black water like a shadow. The soft creak of wood drew Harker's attention. He straightened, peering into the mist. Holmes was already on his feet, balancing with the surety of a cat. "Good evening, Mr. Harker," he called clearly. "An industrious hour for river trade, is it not?" The man spun round, his eyes wild but calculating. "Holmes," he spat, "I thought you cleverer than Borthwick. You should have stayed in your armchair." "And deprive you of your curtain call?" "Impossible," Holmes replied. "You rehearsed this far too carefully for me to miss the finale." Harker gave a low, bitter laugh. "You think you've won? The river takes what it's owed. Vale ruined me, stripped me of livelihood, and now he'll see the cost. The man lives only because I let him, but his empire, his name, goes down with the tide." He struck a match, and for one horrifying instant, the fuse caught the flame. Holmes leapt forward, seizing the canister and wrenching the fuse free. Harker lunged at him, and they went down together upon the wet deck. The barge rocked dangerously, water slapping over its sides. I scrambled aboard, catching the glint of Holmes's revolver as it slid away across the planks. The two men grappled fiercely. Holmes had the advantage of agility, but Harker's desperation lent him savage strength. I caught the barge rope and flung it toward the quay, securing us to the bollard. At that moment, Harker wrenched himself free, seized a boat hook, and swung it with deadly force. Holmes ducked, the hook splintering the railing. I drew my revolver. "Stand where you are, Harker." He turned toward me, panting, eyes fever bright. "You don't understand. He killed me first. Vale, the firm, the world that cast me off. I only buried myself properly." With a sudden motion, he threw himself backward into the river. There was a splash, a swirl of bubbles, and nothing more. Holmes was at the edge in an instant, lantern raised, scanning the black water. For a moment, we saw a pale face, upturned and fleeting in the current. Then the river closed over it. The silence that followed was dreadful. Holmes straightened slowly. "So ends Mr. Harker," he said in a low voice. He kept his appointment with the river after all. We secured the crate and turned it over to the police when Lestrade arrived at dawn. Inside the canister we found blasting powder, sufficient, Holmes calculated, to level the dock and send the debris scattering for half a mile. The manifest, marked C-1135, had been forged to conceal the device among ordinary cargo bound for the colonies. Back in Baker Street that afternoon, Holmes sat by the fire, pipe in hand, his expression calm but remote. "There, Watson," he said quietly. "You have seen the anatomy of revenge, a mind so bent upon symmetry that it fashions its own grave. Harker wished to prove that life and death, business and burial, were one and the same commodity. He ordered his own coffin and set the date himself. It was merely chance that we prevented the audience from sharing the explosion." He smiled faintly, tapping the ash from his pipe. "I trust, however, that Mrs. Hudson will forgive me for bringing home a case which nearly set the Thames ablaze." I could only shake my head in wonder. And yet, Holmes, there was justice in it. Terrible, perhaps, but fitting. "Justice, my dear fellow," he murmured, "is never fitting. It is merely inevitable." Outside, the city pulsed anew, oblivious to the night's grim theatre. And as Holmes turned again to the violin, the first tranquil notes drifted through the smoke-filled room, a requiem, perhaps, for the man who had written his own quietus and kept the river's appointment to the very end. The following morning dawned with a brittle brightness, as though London itself sought to cleanse the memory of the night's horrors with sunlight. Yet within the quiet confines of Baker Street, the atmosphere remained heavy. Holmes sat by the window, a newspaper open upon his knees, but I could tell from the unfocused gleam in his eyes that his attention was far from the printed page. I myself, after so much sleepless strain, found the domestic peace almost oppressive. The fire burned low, and the faint ticking of the mantel clock filled the silence with uneasy rhythm. At last, Holmes folded the paper and spoke. "Our work is not yet complete, Watson," I started. "Surely, Holmes, the matter has ended. Harker is dead, and Borthwick's confession is beyond refutation. Scotland Yard is satisfied, and Mr. Vale is safe." Holmes turned his gaze upon me, the faintest smile touching his lips. "You echo the inspector's conclusion almost word for word. Yet I tell you, this affair, which began with the ordering of a coffin, will not be laid to rest so easily. There remains a shadow behind the shadow." I frowned. "A shadow? You believe there was another conspirator?" "Not a conspirator. An architect," he replied. "Consider the facts. Harker was dismissed 2 years ago. Since then, he lived under assumed names, surviving by petty frauds. Yet within a month, he was able to direct a complex scheme involving forged documents, the bribery of an undertaker, and access to restricted shipping records. Such precision, such method, requires money, information, and, above all, guidance. Who supplied these? Certainly not Borthwick, whose imagination barely extends to arithmetic. No, Watson, somewhere in this web there is one more strand uncut." I knew that tone too well to argue. "Then where do we begin?" "With the river," he said. "That is where Harker ended, and where his design began. There are questions the water may answer if the living cannot." He rose with sudden energy, and within an hour we were again upon the Thames embankment. The police had recovered Harker's body near Limehouse during the early morning tide. We were granted a brief inspection before the inquest. The man's face, pale beneath its grime, bore the unmistakable expression of final despair, but Holmes's attention was drawn not to the countenance, but to the clothing. "You see this, Watson?" he said, indicating the inside pocket of the coat. "The lining has been slit open and resewn. And here, what is this thread? Blue silk, uncommon in men's tailoring." He extracted a small paper folded tightly into a cylinder, the writing blurred but still legible. It read, "For Tuesday, the second key is yours." "The second key?" I exclaimed. "But to what?" "To something that has not yet been found," Holmes murmured. "And observe the date. The paper was dry when the body was recovered, protected by the lining. He carried it sealed. Someone meant it to reach him before the end." He replaced the paper carefully, his brows drawn in concentration. "Harker died believing himself victorious. Therefore, this second key must represent the final act of his scheme, one he did not live to complete. If there is a second key, Watson, there must be a first. I wonder, did we overlook it among the relics of his handiwork?" By late afternoon, we were once more at Scotland Yard, sifting through the confiscated contents of Borthwick's office and Harker's lodgings. It was tedious work, ledgers, invoices, a few personal effects, and, at last, a bundle of letters tied with string. Holmes read them swiftly, discarding each in turn until one caught his attention. It bore the letterhead of Vale and Borthwick Shipping Company, but the signature was indecipherable, merely a looping initial V. He handed it to me. The letter read simply, "You have done well. The quietus proceeds. Await further instructions. Tuesday, 11:35. "Not Vale's hand," Holmes said decisively. "Too studied an imitation, and yet it was found in Harker's possession, not sent to him. He kept it as a token, perhaps a reminder of his master's promise. Then the true author remains at large." Holmes's tone was grim. "We are dealing with one who can mimic handwriting, coordinate elaborate plots, and move unseen within respectable circles. That, my dear Watson, is no ordinary criminal. The brain behind this must belong to a man of culture, education, and proximity to power." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The phrase, "the second key," suggests a mechanism or cipher. The first key, as we now know, was the code C1135. designating both the shipment and the hour. But what of the second? It may well point to something yet untouched, a safe deposit, a hidden document, or another shipment scheduled for release tomorrow. The next morning, a telegram arrived from the docks. Unclaimed cargo in name of Hubert Larch, warehouse 2B. Contents unknown, instructions awaited since Tuesday. Holmes read it aloud and sprang to his feet. Watson, the river keeps its secrets poorly. The quietus may not have ended after all. When we reached the warehouse, the clerks were already gathered about a long crate, smaller than the earlier one, but sealed with the same green wax. Holmes examined the markings. This time the code read Q2K. He gave a low whistle. The second key indeed. Let us see what final jest our adversary has prepared. With a crowbar, he pried open the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a ledger bound in black leather. Holmes turned its pages, his expression shifting from interest to astonishment. Every page was filled with columns of figures and initials, bribes, payments, falsified freight records, all signed discreetly with the same looping V. Holmes closed the book with a snap. "Watson," he said quietly, "this is no mere revenge. It is exposure, a ledger of corruption reaching far beyond Vale's firm. Harker was not only settling his own score, he was executing someone else's vendetta. And the owner of this ledger, the true author of the quietus, still walks free." The wind off the river rattled the windows as he tucked the black ledger under his arm. "The coffin was ordered for Tuesday, my friend," he said softly. "But it seems Tuesday has yet to bury the living." Holmes and I returned to Baker Street under a sky veiled by rolling grey clouds. The black ledger lay upon the table between us, its weight far greater than its modest size suggested. Holmes had examined it twice already, marking certain pages with slips of paper, yet his expression remained unreadable. He had smoked 3 pipes in silence before he finally rose, turned to the window, and spoke in that low tone which always preceded revelation. "Watson, this book is the confession of a phantom. The initials, the forged entries, the sums, all trace back not to the underworld, but to a man seated in Parliament. The same man who founded Vale and Borthwick's shipping empire and later withdrew, leaving his name untarnished while others dirtied their hands. Do you recall the Honourable Cyril Vale, elder brother to our client?" I started. "Vale's brother, but he is a man of impeccable repute." "Impeccable facades often hide the rotting foundations of empires," Holmes replied grimly. "The elder Vale employed Harker years ago to falsify accounts for colonial contracts. When Harker was exposed, Cyril abandoned him and allowed the firm to dismiss him without pension. Borthwick, ever greedy, continued the practice for his own gain. The ledger was their shared secret until the cast-off clerk plotted to unmask them both. Harker's vengeance was meticulous. He meant to ruin the House of Vale by turning its own deceit into spectacle. Cyril's letter to Borthwick, masquerading as Harker's cue, sealed the matter. And when the scheme threatened to unravel, the elder brother attempted to silence his agent with that fatal note, "The river waits for no man." The chain of deduction left me momentarily speechless. Then Cyril Vale is the true author of the quietus, said Holmes. The coffin ordered in his brother's name was more than revenge. It was camouflage. Once the supposed death of Alistair Vale was public, Cyril could have claimed control of the company's assets and suppressed the ledger forever. Harker's death merely hastened his convenience. Before I could speak again, the bell below rang sharply. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, Mr. Alistair Vale himself, visibly shaken. "Holmes," he cried, "you must come at once. My brother, he has shot himself." Holmes neither flinched nor spoke for several seconds. Then, taking his hat, he said quietly, "The inevitable denouement, Watson. Let us go." At the elder Vale's residence in Kensington, the servants led us to a study reeking of gunpowder. The man lay slumped over his desk, a revolver fallen to the carpet, the black ledger open before him. On a single sheet beside it was scrawled, "The river has claimed us all." Holmes stood over the body, his face set like marble. "So ends the architect of the quietus," he murmured. He could face exposure by no mortal hand, so he sought judgment from the one tribunal that cannot be bribed. He turned to Alistair, whose features were drawn with sorrow and disbelief. "You, sir, are free, though your name must now bear the burden of another's guilt. See that you rebuild what he destroyed, with honesty this time." As we left the house, the afternoon light had dimmed to amber. Holmes paused upon the step, gazing westward where the sun burned low through the haze. "There is always a river, Watson," he said softly. "For some it is the Thames, for others, conscience. Both will drown what cannot float." I followed him silently back to Baker Street, where he resumed his seat by the fire, as though the entire grim symphony had been but an exercise in reason. And when at last the silence grew deep, I realized that even in triumph there lingered in Holmes's eyes that distant melancholy which so often shadowed the brilliance of his mind, the look of one who solves all riddles but finds no peace in the answers. The fog returned to London the next evening as if summoned to seal the memory of that grim affair beneath its grey veil. I found Holmes by the hearth, his long fingers tracing idle patterns upon the violin that lay across his knees. The soft glow of the fire outlined his features, calm yet distant. The black ledger, the final relic of the coffin, ordered for Tuesday, rested upon the mantel, its secrets now known but its shadow lingering. "The pattern completes itself, Watson," Holmes began quietly. "Each life entangled in this case formed a perfect circle of cause and consequence. Greed gave birth to fraud, fraud to vengeance, vengeance to ruin. What began with a coffin ended with a confession." I nodded, though unease still stirred within me. "You've unmasked every culprit and laid the truth bare, yet I cannot call it victory. Too many graves were dug in the pursuit of justice, some literal, others of the spirit." Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes half closed. "You speak, my dear fellow, as though justice were a gentle art. It is not. It is the surgeon's scalpel, necessary, precise, and cruel. Cyril Vale lived his life concealing corruption beneath the trappings of respectability. When his own weapon, deceit, turned against him, he met an end entirely of his own making. Harker's tragedy was no different. He built his revenge with such symmetry that it required his own destruction to complete it. He drew upon his pipe, the thin smoke curling like thought itself. In the end, it was not my deductions that destroyed them, but their own logic carried to its conclusion. I merely turned the mirror. For a time, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. I found myself staring into its heart, recalling each step of that haunting investigation, the undertaker's trembling visit, the false coffin order, the wax seals, the number 1135, the river glinting in the moonlight. Each piece had seemed trivial at first, yet together they had formed a chain strong enough to drag men to their doom. "And Mr. Alistair Vale?" I asked at last. "He has inherited his brother's estate, but I cannot envy him the task." "The scandal will never break," Holmes interrupted gently. "Lestrade has agreed to suppress the details. The ledger is now in government custody, its contents sealed. Alistair Vale is free to rebuild his firm upon honest foundations. I believe he will. Sometimes disgrace is a cleaner inheritance than wealth." His gaze drifted toward the window, where the fog pressed close against the panes. "It is curious, Watson, that men of ambition so often dig their own graves with the same tools that raise their fortunes. Harker's intellect, Borthwick's cunning, Vale's influence, all instruments of power, yet each served destruction in the end. The coffin was their masterpiece, and in it they buried themselves." He fell silent, then gave a small, rueful laugh. There is, I suppose, a grim poetry in it. The coffin ordered for Tuesday arriving precisely on time, though not for the man it was meant to claim. I smiled faintly. Then the river's debt was paid in full. Perhaps, Holmes murmured. The river, like truth, waits for no man. The clock upon the mantel chimed 9, soft and deliberate. Holmes rose, setting the violin upon the table, and turned to face me. You see now, Watson, why I say the work is its own punishment. We illuminate the dark corners of men's hearts, only to find the same shadows waiting in each. Yet, he paused, his eyes brightening with that peculiar fire I had seen in him only after the most taxing cases. I would not trade it for any peace the world could offer. And you, Holmes, I said, are the surgeon London cannot do without. It bleeds, but it lives because of you. He inclined his head slightly as though accepting a compliment he did not wish to claim. I am merely the instrument, my dear friend. It is the pattern that dictates the tune. Outside, the foghorns moaned across the river, and the world beyond the window dissolved into pale mystery. Holmes took up his violin once more and drew the bow across the strings. The sound that followed was neither mournful nor triumphant, but contemplative, a requiem for the guilty and a benediction for the truth. As the final note faded, he turned to me with that rare warmth that softened the austerity of his manner. And now, Watson, the case is truly laid to rest. Let us close the ledger and the coffin alike. Tomorrow, no doubt, another puzzle will find its way to Baker Street, and we shall begin again. He leaned back in his chair, smoke curling upward from his pipe like a benediction to the night. And as I looked upon him, the tireless guardian of logic in a city of shadows, I felt once more that deep, unshakable admiration which every case renewed. For though Holmes claimed no faith, he lived by one truth alone, that reason, like the Thames, may be dark and cold, but it always, inexorably, finds its course to the light. And so ended the case of the coffin, ordered for Tuesday, not with the applause of justice, but with the quiet certainty that no lie, however artful, can long resist the hand that lifts its lid.